Hello and welcome. My name is Jennifer Gates, Field Services Director for the California Preservation Foundation. We want to thank you today for joining this webinar entitled Introduction to Disaster Planning and Cultural Resources. This introduction is for the upcoming workshop to be held in Brea, California later this month, entitled Before and After, Disaster Preparedness and Cultural Resources. Also in November, you will see two webinars, one entitled California Architecture, One State, Divisible or Indivisible, as well as a webinar on structural requirements and archaic materials. We encourage you to become a member, if you're not already, of CPF and enjoy the benefits and educational discounts. The format for today's webinar will include a presentation followed by time for questions and answers. There is a toolbar on the right side of your screen. If you have a question at any time during the presentation, please type it in the box and we will hold the question until the end for the presenter to answer. You will be muted throughout the presentation. To hide or unhide this toolbar, click on the orange arrow. Please adjust your volume on your computer or phone. Today's presentation will be by Ione Stiegler. In her 27 years of professional experience, Ione Stiegler, Fellow of the American Institute of Architects, has established IS Architecture as an award-winning firm dedicated to the preservation and renewal of our built environment. Her firm specializes in historic restoration and adaptive reuse of existing structures. Her interdisciplinary methodology unearths a multitude of architectural details, making it possible to reach back in time to scientifically and authentically recreate previously lost architectural elements. Her comprehensive documentation fosters historically accurate reconstruction, preserves our historically significant architectural heritage, and provides disaster recovery records. Located in La Jolla, IS Architecture has restored or rehabilitated 45 historic residences, 17 institutional historic structures, and 8 historic adobe structures. The firm has received 38 awards for both its custom residential and historic preservation architecture and has been published 53 times in national, regional, and local publications. Thank you for joining us today, Ione.
Thank you so much for having me. So welcome everybody. We're going to be looking at this topic through the lens of what occurred at Sikes Adobe Farmhouse. I'd like to entitle this Life on the Edge of the Urban Wilderness Wildfire Interface. And this is a story in 4 parts: a historic structures report, a restoration, a disaster, and a reconstruction. First, a little background about the project and the resource. As you can see, this is a picture of the resource in the 1880s, and it was a sparse agrarian landscape, and the property was used to grow wheat. And right here is the Sikes Adobe in the distance, and it was serviced by the town of Bernardo that no longer exists. It currently sits in a long linear park that is operated by the San Diego River Park, and fortunately, due to its park siting, it still maintains today a lot of its rural setting. Our firm in 2002 was hired to prepare a historic structures report and design and oversee the restoration of the resource. As you can see in a moment, we were again rehired in 2007. As I like to explain to clients, I can't start the architecture without first conducting a thorough research of the history of the resource. So our historic structures report starts with researching the historical overview and setting. And here you can see the family that we were studying, Zenith Sikes, the father, his wife, and his 5 children here. In about 1872, the Zenith Sikes family moved into the one-room adobe that the family quickly outgrew and made several wooden additions to the original structure. Here's another picture in the 1880s with Mrs. Sikes and one of her children can be seen at the gate. Our archival research included searching for historic photographs like this one and other documents. For this project, our historian discovered a wealth of probate records. Zenith Sikes had died in 1884, and his will was in probate for over 8 years. So we were able to learn about every item his widow bought or sold over those years. And because those records were dated, we could find out information even down to the fact of what she was serving for Thanksgiving dinner in any given year, or the music she bought for the musicians to play at his funeral. It was a fascinating wealth of information. Our historic structures report goes beyond just the historic research, and we move into documentation. Here are some of the as-found conditions. The process continues with a review of the existing conditions with both site measurements and architectural drawings, as well as a full photographic survey. We prepare a detailed description of the materials and the character-defining elements of the building. This is the north elevation, and you can see here the adobe gable end of the building, and then one of the wooden infills. This is the west elevation, and the adobe portion of the building steps right through here. And then from this line over is a wooden addition. All of this information that we gather in the documentation process is used to assist in the establishment of a period of significance for the restoration. In other words, we're looking at what point in the evolution of this building was the height of this resource's historical significance. For this building, it was determined to be the 8-year period just after Zenith passed away. This period marked not only the point when the farm was financially very successful, but also correlated to the zenith of the various construction episodes at the site. One item to note is that these were farmers that had grown up in the Midwest and were used to sod huts that were fairly common at the time, but they were strangers to adobe construction. So compared to our Californo Spanish-Mexican heritage with our standard construction practices for adobes, this adobe was very poorly built. There were no cobble foundations. They had just dug a shallow trench in the dirt and started laying up the adobe on top of the dirt. And the adobe blocks were laid only 1 width wide. So instead of our region's typical adobe wall thicknesses of 20 to 24 inches, this building's walls were only 12 to 14 inches thick. This was a significant challenge for the seismic upgrade that we did for the unreinforced masonry. If you wouldn't mind, please try to remember this room with all of its horizontal beadboard siding and how it transitions from the kitchen on the left-hand side here to the bedrooms as one level space over here on the right-hand side. So beadboards and one level area. As we explored the building, we discovered a unique construction pattern. As opposed to the typical construction pattern where you would have had a first section here and then railroad car fashion added a second section and then perhaps a third or fourth section, instead the discovered construction pattern was that they actually moved onto the site a wholly independent second building and then infilled between. And we were able to determine this construction pattern based on the fact that we had an exterior wall here and an exterior wall here once we removed that beadboard siding, and we could see the old grime and the old layers of exterior exposure both facing to each other in this interior room. And then came the really unexpected find that this second edition had actually at one point, after all of this had been built together, been lowered 18 inches. So whereas we found it as one level building going across, it actually originally had had an 18-inch step from the middle section up into this addition. We were able to correlate wallpaper alignments from one side of the center section to the other which documented the offset. And here are some of those pieces, examples of the wallpaper that we used from one side to the other side to align the levels. We had probate records of multiple purchases of wallpaper over the 8 years, and walking into the building the way it stood, you couldn't see a single scrap of wallpaper. And so we started examining under the beadboard siding, and lo and behold, multiple layers of wallpaper started becoming uncovered. So if you recall that other room with the horizontal wood beadboard, this is what we found underneath it. In 8 years, Mrs. Sikes had actually added a total of 4 layers of wallpaper to the existing. We like to call this her merry widow period. She was having a lot of fun with her wallpaper. Anyhow, the restoration process followed, and I'll skip over the large majority of it because we're looking at a different topic with this building. But you can see here a removal of the non-historic cementitious plaster coat in preparation for a mud coat and lime whitewash finish, and a corner of the unreinforced adobe that needed repair, as well as some of the adobe blocks that we made on site. And we were able to make these using the exact same burrow pit where the original soil had been borrowed from to make adobes, so that they were similar in consistency. The unseen goal of this portion of the restoration was to prepare for a seismic event. That's the typical disaster that an adobe needs to prepare for. We were structurally reinforcing the building and tying together the unreinforced sections through the roof as a diaphragm. And here is the west facade before, and here you get a picture of the restoration as it morphs for after. And then here we are at the grand opening in 2004, and everybody's celebrating. And then, of course, the worst thing happened. In 2007, we had the Witch Creek fire, a natural disaster that covered over 197,000 acres, destroyed over 1,000 homes, 414 outbuildings, 239 vehicles. It caused 2 deaths and injured 39 firefighters and 2 civilians. 2 days into the fires, approximately 500,000 people from at least 346,000 homes were under mandatory orders to evacuate. It was the largest evacuation in the region's history. Here's a photo when the wooden portion of the Sikes Adobe building was almost completely gone. Here is what was left. While all sections of the Historic Structures Report were important at the time they were created, after the fire loss of the resource, it was primarily that detailed physical description of elements that I described before, as well as the materials and spaces of the building, coupled with the prior restoration construction documents that literally served as the blueprint for the reconstruction of the resource. Here you can note the steel remains from the seismic stabilization. All of these bent metal pieces had actually folded flat the other way and tied to plywood in the roof to form a diaphragm. The burnt out locations of where the former headers had been here at the window, so literally the wood burned out, and I don't know, this adobe's staying up by memory. A thin crust of red-fired brick basically is what occurred on the exterior of what had originally been the unfired, sun-baked only adobe. The agency that supported this building had the double tragedy in that they also lost their headquarters and library in the fire. So 3 days after the fire, when I went out to meet them on site and assess the ruins, I greeted them with a duplicate copy of the Historic Structures Report under one arm and the roll of blueprints from the prior restoration under the other. But of course, everyone's concern at the time was where would the money possibly come from to rebuild. Yay, insurance. Thankfully, one of the property management groups in the city of San Diego had thought to purchase first dollar replacement cost insurance. Historic buildings have very special craftsmanship requirements that need to be addressed within a customized insurance policy. For example, if a historic property is damaged, the materials needed to restore it may not be found at the local building supply store. There are three primary types of insurance: replacement cost, or also known as value, actual cash value, and historic replacement cost. The typical definition of replacement cost or replacement cost value is the cost to replace with the like and kind quality after loss, without regard to depreciation. This can be a good type of policy if your insurance company recognizes that all aspects of the original materials and design are included in the definition of like and kind quality, which in our case, fortunately, they did. So while the insurance company had a hard time swallowing that this building would cost almost $500 a square foot to reconstruct, when they initially estimated it at $150 a square foot, we eventually got them to come around. To explain a little deeper why actual cash value is problematic, here's a word of warning. The actual cash value insurance is the least appropriate for a historic resource, since the definition of actual cash value is the cost to replace with like and kind quality after a loss and after deductions for depreciation. The use of the word depreciation and the insurance company's control of determining the value after depreciation can leave the resource without sufficient funds to be repaired or restored. So while you and I highly value that 100 to 200-year-old piece of wood with wonderfully hand-hewn marks on it, the insurance company sees a piece of wood that can easily be replaced by any new piece of lumber bought at Home Depot. Relatively new to the insurance market is historic replacement cost. While there's not yet an industry standard definition, the intention of historic replacement cost coverage is to provide you with the 3 R's after a loss: replacement, repair, and restoration. This is a specific product for the historic preservation market. This customized insurance is something to keep in mind and ask about. So, where did we get started with our post-disaster stabilization? The adobe, while partially surviving the fire, had been baked in place like a brick, creating a hardened crust over the softer adobe mud core. With no roof to protect the fragile walls and with the winter rains imminent, the resource needed immediate protection from the weather while awaiting the restoration process. Our first response was to literally shrink wrap the building like a big but gentle hug, to just hold it together till more could be done. Fortunately, FEMA funds were secured with the assistance of the State Office of Historic Preservation to temporarily stabilize the building and span the gap until the restoration and reconstruction project could start. Part of the complication in our post-disaster stabilization had been that the roof of the structure had been an integral part of the prior restoration's seismic stabilization design. Without the roof diaphragm to absorb some of the seismic loads, the resource was now vulnerable to seismic damage. Since creating the restoration and reconstruction documents would take months, and obtaining the necessary approvals for the design would take additional time, it was determined that the temporary emergency stabilization may need to remain in place for an extended period of time. The design of the emergency stabilization served both the needs of protecting the walls from weather and shoring the walls from collapse due to seismic forces. The walls were braced with wooden shoring, and the top and sides of the walls were protected with corrugated metal panel. The design was also built from materials that could have remained in place for several years if the need had arisen. At the point that we were actually doing this disaster stabilization, we had not yet had enough discussions with our insurance company to really have any idea where we stood with whether we were going to be able to rebuild. And so the goal for this FEMA money was to be able to keep it in place as long as it was going to take. So you can see here we protected the top edges of the adobe from rain. We cross-braced it, we stabilized it just in case there were any earthquakes imminent. And then we added this extra fringe to help continue to bounce rainwater away from the highly friable adobe. Once we finished the reconstruction design, which was several months, we then started the actual restoration of the adobe portion of the building and the reconstruction of the wooden portion of the building. The painstaking process started of carefully stripping the flaking fire-hardened layer. And here you can see where the workman has been picking through the edges to clean back to solid material as opposed to this surface, which is what he was confronted with. Remember, we only had 12 inches of thickness to begin with, and you can see that right here. So we were very concerned that if we needed to take 2 inches or more off of each side, like here and here, we might only have 8 inches of adobe left. So we really needed to do a careful balancing act between finding stable surfaces of the adobe to restore from and what we had to repair. Here you can see a prepped wall and an unprepped wall. The emergency stabilization, which is this wooden band here that ties to the shoring going out. And the original 2004 steel seismic strengthening fire chart here. The work was done under moistened burlap to allow the mud coats to cure slowly in the hot weather. The mud plaster was applied in layers to get back to that historic thickness, acknowledging the thickness of the wall that we lost in prepping it. Wood lintels were reinstalled. Small portions of the wall had failed and were rebuilt. Post-fire, with the lintels having burnt out here and here, this section of wall was just too thin to be able to self-support itself and had collapsed. And this was where we had to rebuild. The roof was again used as part of the seismic stabilization. Here the plywood roof sheathing was strapped to the adobe to carry loads from the adobe wall into the roof sheathing, acting as a shear plane. Very similar design to what had been done in the original restoration in 2004. As a concession to the insurance adjuster and to meet certain fire and building codes, we agreed that we would use modern materials in many locations that would later be hidden from the public eye. But we insisted on full dimension historic lumber thicknesses where it could be seen. Our redesign, or our reconstruction, I should say, and restoration, while once again attempting to protect this building from a seismic event, acknowledged now the presence of a potential for an external fire event. The original restoration had a fire sprinkler system inside the building, but that system was designed for an internal fire, not a fire sweeping in from external, branches and embers. And so it wasn't designed to be able to handle that. So our new reconstruction and restoration design took into consideration the needs of preparing for an external fire event, as well as, again, the potential for an internal fire event. Some of you may be familiar with the fire codes that now require dual pane windows in order to protect from fire, but there was no way we would put those in a historic building. So the local building agency wouldn't recognize a reconstruction as being allowed to use single pane windows. However, in place of the building code requiring those dual pane windows, we were able to convince the building official that we could use a design that provided alternative compliance by installing fire suppression sprinkler heads over the exterior of every opening. All exposed framing was now required to meet the standards of heavy timber per the local San Diego building codes, which meant new structural framing members were required now to be a nominal 3.5 inches, 5.5 inches, or larger. The heavy timber requirements also required the porch flooring dimensions to increase from a nominal 7/8 inch thickness that it had been historically to a 2.5 inch thickness. And here, this picture from '04, you can see the 7/8 thickness. And here, while it's under construction, you can see our 2.5 inch thick floorboards and how this edge profile would never have been as elegant as what had originally been there. But what we did was we back cut that floorboards, and then we overlapped the skirt material so that it could meet the fire codes of being 2.5 inches thick but be buried, and we could get back to the very elegant 7/8 inch thickness. Additional fire protection measures included using treated lumber. The use of fire retardant treated lumber was permitted by the building code officials only when no other means could maintain the historic authenticity while providing a fire-resistive construction. The elements that used this approach were the exposed roof rafter tails and the turned porch posts. Their heavy timber dimensions would have required these posts to be far larger than the historic dimensions. And given all the other measures we were taking in the building, they allowed these to simply be fire retardant treated lumber. These elements were painted with an intumescent paint and were thus protected. We also put in additional fire protection measures in terms of non-flammable barriers. The reconstruction rebuilt the historic wooden louver attics, which you can see right here, but we mounted behind them a fire-resistive louver, which was buried unseen within the attic. Post-2007 fire analysis had shown that many of these attic vents had allowed in a lot of embers that had caught a number of buildings on fire from within their attic due to the vents. And so there was no compromise with the fire department on having just the wooden vent. We had to have the additional fire-resistive vent behind it. In addition, we were required to put an underlayment of fire-resistant gypsum board over the plywood and under what would be the historically recreated wood siding. So this is another fire protection measure that was well hidden within the rebuilt building. The new fire suppression system was designed to protect both from an internal structure fire and from a fast-moving wildfire. The San Diego region typically has a predictable weather pattern of strong Santa Ana winds blowing from the east during the height of our fire-prone fall season. Based on computer fire modeling, the exterior of the building had fire sprinklers strategically mounted on the perimeter. The sprinklers were concentrated in front of windows, below wooden eaves, and under the porch roof. Here we are, rebuilt in 2010, with the added benefit now of both earthquake stabilization and significant well-hidden fire protection measures. And then at the grand reopening, this is a group of the Sikes descendants who came to see us reopen. I'd like to take the time to acknowledge our project team. Michael Martinez from our office was the project manager during the second reconstruction and restoration. Von Marie May for her cultural landscape work during the historic structures report. Walter Enterprises, Stephen Van Wormer and Susan Walter were our archaeologists through both phases of the project. The initial phase, they struggled to reach under some of those wood floors. The second phase, those wood floors were gone and they had access to a lot of information from things that had fallen through the wooden floors through the years. And so we took the opportunity to get some additional archaeological information out of the site. Laura Burnett with Wallace Roberts and Todd, landscape architects. Melvin Green and Associates, our structural engineer. Philip Schlotz Ritterman, our HABS photographer. John A. Martini, our interpretive consultant, and Mark Sauer of Mark Sauer Construction for both projects, the 2004 restoration and then the 2008 through 10 reconstruction and restoration. And that's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ione. At this time, if you have specific questions of Ione, please go ahead and type them into the box, and we'll go ahead and ask Ione those questions. Ione, do you at this time, while we're waiting for questions, have any thoughts or comments about disaster planning and the importance with our cultural resources?
I think the thing that I see the most of is what I would say are thinly written historic structures reports. And we attempt to write what I would call a fairly robust historic structures report, really describing in detail, photographing and measuring not just the sizes of the rooms, but the individual components of the room, because suddenly with the disaster of the complete loss of a resource, the exact size, length, width, thickness of that board floor was something that was important to know. And if someone had just come in and said it's a T&G wood flooring, maybe given the species of the wood, mostly they don't, with no additional real information, you couldn't possibly have rebuilt, reconstructed in such a thorough manner. We even, reconstructed right down to, I didn't show a picture of it, but if you guys can follow my arrows here, there had been on the other side of the building, not this side, but I'll just mark it out here, a doorway that had been in the siding that had been closed up some point in the 1880s. And it was significant because we had a letter from Mrs. Sikes describing to her friend Martha the fact that she had closed up that door. And when you arrived at the site, you could clearly see where that door had been, and then we found the historic information of her telling us she closed it. So when we did the reconstruction, we felt it was very important that that door get incised again. So whereas it would have been easy during a reconstruction to just, slap on the horizontal siding and move on, we actually, went back and did the saw cut through so that you still today can now read where that historic door had been that she talks about in her letters.
Thank you. One of the questions is, what professionals were involved in developing a historic resources or historic structures report? And what is the role of a conservator?
Historic structures reports can have quite a few different consultants on board. I think the nature of the resource to a certain extent dictates what kind of professionals you need. I believe you need a architectural historian to research the history of the building if that hasn't been thoroughly researched yet, because you need to then tie the history to the building. I think a historic preservation architect is a good consultant to be the lead on putting together that report, tying the history to the building. The architect has more insight, I think, in the construction means and methods of the original building to be able to discuss them. In this case, because we had this farmstead in a rural agrarian landscape, and how it had been part of a larger landscape was very important. That's why we brought on a cultural landscape specialist as well as a landscape architect who specializes in historic preservation. We were working with unstabilized Adobe, and so a structural engineer was critical. On other resources that have electrical or mechanical, bringing on engineers that can handle evaluating the condition of those systems within the building is important. This didn't have any electricity or mechanical, so we didn't need that for this project. I think a good photographer is very, very helpful unless someone else on the team can handle the photographer's role. The park, in our case for this project, was very interested in how they were going to go about interpreting the resource in the future. It was part of their extensive trail system, and so for them it was important that we bring in an interpretive consultant, and he helped identify 6 major themes that the historic farmstead to this day does its educational component organized around those 6 different themes. I think that's, later in the process, once you're getting into restoration or reconstruction, having a good fire consultant is very important, and I should acknowledge Aon Fire Protection and their role in assisting us with the reconstruction. Is there a second part to that question?
Yes, this is, what is the role of a conservator in developing a historic resources report?
Yeah, so we also actually don't always use a conservator, but we almost always at least have a paint analysis done in the historic structures report, where we take paint samples from all over the building, and Susan Buck from Paint Chips is who we typically use, and she's able to do cross-section microscopy. And for example, with this resource, she was able to tell us that second building that got moved onto the site and sat there until it got connected to the main Adobe, that building had sat with bare plaster walls for decades, most probably due to a lack of money, before a first coat of paint was ever put on. So her information added to the written documentation so that we could have a better picture of the rise and fall of the economics at the site and the owners. The conservator I can see as having a larger role when you might be losing some historic fabric. And we brought on actually a conservator to salvage and gently peel apart the different layers of wallpaper so that we could analyze the time frame and where she was getting this wallpaper from. And so that was the conservator's role, was more with materials and certain elements of the building, decorative elements of the building.
Is the Historic Structures Report public or available to be reviewed?
I don't know if it's public. I'd have to ask my client whether they'd wish for it to be public. But it did win a CPF award for how thoroughly it connected both a landscape analysis with a traditional building analysis, combining the different reports.
All right, we have another question. When you modeled the building for a fire, did you model a large wildfire like the 2007 fire?
Yeah, Aon Fire Suppression handled that modeling. They have their own equipment. It wasn't like we were using a architect's rivet model. And they have, with their very sophisticated modeling system, the ability to model that wildfire. And it was specifically modeling a wildfire that convinced the building officials that our adapted approach would be successful in a wildfire.
All right, do we have any more questions? For Ione? Looks like we're getting one. I had a question in regards to FEMA. Can you talk a little bit more about how FEMA was involved and your in working with that organization and OHP? Do you have did you work directly with them or the organization itself?
I did not work directly with FEMA. That happened through the San Diego River Park, the owners and operators of the site. However, I did facilitate getting Wayne Donaldson, at the time the head of OHP, down to the site to see what our conditions were and where we wanted to go from what was left. And he was incredibly responsive. It was wonderful. He was there within the first week after the fire. And they were, as I understood it, OHP was incredibly helpful to the San Diego River Park in facilitating processing the FEMA funds. But I apologize, I can't tell you in what specifics they helped. I do know that we had to write up some reports to identify how we would use the funds and diagrams for our intended stabilization effort.
There is another question, and the question is, does the Sikes Adobe have a disaster plan in place now, aside from the fire suppression systems mentioned?
I don't know. That's a great question. I'll have to ask. Um, I a disaster preparedness plan in terms of, now to a certain extent, I guess they do, in that now the local fire department is aware of who they are, where they are, and why they're important. Nothing can beat a fireman knowing that this is an important building to be saved. And we've done similar education for other resources up near Warner's Ranch. The I guess the hope is that all of the fire protection measures kick into place, and there is no need for any other kind of disaster preparedness.
All right. Well, thank you very much today for joining us. And if there's any more questions, please go ahead and type those in. Thank you again for joining us. And later today, you will receive an email with a link to a survey. And we would appreciate any feedback on this webinar, as well as recommendations for any future topics. I will also send an email with the final PowerPoint presentation from today. And not seeing any more questions, we hope that you have a good rest of the afternoon. And thank you very much, Ione, for your presentation.
Thank you for having me. Thanks so much.
Thank you.